the beginning. So as we begin to look at the book of Genesis further, and we focus today on Genesis 12, then we need to think about the importance of the original context and setting. So today we're going to look at Genesis 12 to 50. And before we begin, we will become better and better Old Testament scholars if we know more of the original language, which is Hebrew. And you could go to Google and type in Genesis 1 interlinear, and you could read Genesis 1 in the original language. You could go to Genesis 12 interlinear on Google, and it would give you the original Hebrew language to some extent in Genesis 12. If we know something of the culture where they had temples and some of the nations had idols and they built altars, and interestingly, Abraham builds an altar. Now, I don't know if any of your families have altars, but in some Hindu families, they have altars and they do offerings and all of those things. I remember last time I was in Kathmandu in Nepal, I saw a chicken being brought out for an offering. And I felt very concerned for the chicken who was being brought out for an offering. And so back in Abraham's time, they had offerings and altars. And so we need to know something about the culture and the context and the background there. And then Tillich has raised a very good question, is what about the literary devices that are used in the structure? One of the things that I find very interesting is that much of Genesis is narrative, where Abraham is called, he sets out on a journey, and narrative speaks to us because we all have a narrative of our lives. Actually, narrative psychology would suggest that narrative often speaks into our lives and that our lives can be shaped by narrative. And so if you wanted to explore narrative psychology further, then you could see the way scholars have discussed and examined the ways this notion of a story helps make sense of your life. Narrative psychology looks at how a story shapes your life. And as a child, you're a part of a family, but you're also developing. So there's a story you tell yourself when you're 2 or 3 or 4. And then as you go to school, you tell yourself a bit bigger story. I'm now a child who is growing up. And then you tell yourself a bit bigger story when you become a teenager. You tell another bit bigger story. I'm developing an identity as a certain person. The friends you mix with may shape different stories you tell yourself. And so here in Genesis 12, Abraham's telling a story that is going to shape the identity of the nation. And so narratives shape our human experiences, narratives shape our social experience, and narrative sociology can describe the ways in which communities and groups shape the way they think and believe. As a Christian group, you will have a certain narrative, social description of who you are as a group. And each different church may tell a slightly different story. Some churches tell a story, we are oppressed and sad because no one likes us. Some children tell a story, we are oppressed and sad, no one likes us. Others tell a triumphant story, we are going to do well. It would be interesting to reflect on your church. What story does your church tell? Is your church a struggling group or a triumphal group? And how you understand yourself and your group can also affect how you understand God and the way He is working. So narrative psychology, narrative sociology reflects the way we understand our memories, our identity, the way we make meaning, the way we behave, the way we see one another. So narrative, the story that we tell, is quite important in shaping the way we think. So, narrative as a literary device, I think, is quite important. Now, let me share a secret with you now. If you want to write a top selling book and make a lot of money and make a movie, then I'm told that narratives follow a narrative arc, certainly in Western society, a narrative arc or storyline. So, what usually happens is that the narrative arc or the narrative storyline begins with everything fairly straightforward, and then a problem arises, and then they move towards solving that narrative arc storyline problem. And in Western storytelling, it's usually outworked towards the end of the narrative arc or the story line. And this can open up different ways in which we see things happening in our lives. So the narrative arc or storyline begins with rising action, reaching a climax where the problem is addressed, and then moving towards a solution. So in the literary device, we may see, in fact, this moving towards the solution there. Tilak, have you come across the idea of a narrative storyline or a narrative arc before, where you have a plot that develops, a problem being addressed, and then you move towards rising increased problem and climax, and then towards a solution? Tilak, have you come across that before?
I have read somewhere, sir, but not specifically like knowing the thing, but just I want to
Yes.
learn. I want to know.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And if
Because
you
because
take, yes, go on.
okay. Because when we read the story, if we cannot understand the tone, the language, what
Yeah.
is written over there, then we cannot delve into the real depth or real meaning of the text. So first to understand, like as you are teaching us till this day, that we have to first know the historical context, the breeze, and the present context. So first to know the historical context, then I think these are the most essential thing to know first. Then only we can like apply it in our daily life. First, we have to know the original context. So to know, I think these are most important thing. That's why I was asking, sir.
Yeah, very, very good, very important. And of course, knowing the story context gives us part of our understanding, but then the author is seeking to draw us in, and we identify with what is happening. And then the author is seeking to set up challenges and problems and resolutions. So we're drawn in mentally and psychologically into this. So if you type into Google narrative arc storyline and go to the images, that will take you to some of the examples of what Western storytelling is doing now in 2025 AD. This may be slightly different to what the storytelling of the Hebrew storytellers in 1400 BC were doing, which could be different to what the Greek authors will be doing when they do storytelling in ancient Greece, with the Iliad and the Odyssey as some of the first and most famous ancient Greek storytellings. And it could be slightly different to Jesus' storytelling in the Gospels, in the parables, where Jesus tells parable stories. And so there are different ways of telling stories that vary. We do need people in Nepal and Kathmandu to tell the Nepal Kathmandu stories. And so, if you have a gift for studying stories and writing about stories, we do need people who can do that and can also bring the Christian message into the ways the story is told, because the Christian narrative arc storyline has a particular approach that is similar to what we read here, in that God makes a good world, Genesis chapter 1, but the world breaks apart, Genesis chapter 3. And then God makes the world good, but when we come to Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, Noah is there, and God looks at the world and he says, the world is bad. And then God says he wants to bring water and wash it all clean and make it all new again. And so we have the storyline developing, things going bad, God makes it clean. But then God finds someone, Noah, that is righteous and good and who listens and walks in the ways of God. And so Noah is able to save a small group of people in the midst of dreadful, terrible things happening with terrible people. And then it comes to a resolution. Moses is able to bring about the people continuing. And so that is one narrative story that is told. And now, when we come to Abraham being called, we have another narrative story that is told. Some people have said that the narrative storyline connects with the way we think psychologically and mentally. And so there is some connection with our life journey, how we understand and see things. We have meaning and purpose, but we face a crisis. You can have a healthy response to the crisis where you follow what is right, be open and true, or you can have an unhealthy response to the crisis. And you see both of those in the biblical story and the biblical narrative. So I think narrative to me is a particularly interesting literary approach that is worth exploring. Other genres and approaches we see, one is poetry, and poetry has a certain way of communicating song too, which can use a lot more metaphor and rhythm. And they can say, the trees will clap their hands. Well, I look out at the forest out here and I don't see trees clapping their hands. It's a metaphor. And so poetry uses metaphor, but it expresses deep inner truths which are less literal. Yesterday, some of the students asked about conservative and liberal. And I think that's a little bit worth keeping in mind, because a conservative person says things are to be taken literal. So a conservative says the word should be taken literally. And so where the Bible says women wear head coverings, they should. And where there's a passage in the Bible that says men should not cut their hair, they shouldn't cut their hair or shouldn't shave their beards. But that would lead to contradictions, because some passages in the Bible talk about cutting your hair and others not cutting your hair. And so we have cultural problems, because in different times and different places and different cultures, then the conservative literal approach could lead to a problem. Also, one of the things the conservative literal approach says, that simply obey God, which sounds good, but the person who communicates the word obey God might be the leader or the preacher, and they will interpret it. So if they say women keep quiet, men speak, that will be that interpretation of obey God. So again, this literal interpretation leads to a problem in conservatives. I think conservative is good when conservative speaks about truths that are very real and important for us, but it's not so good if it is manipulated and used wrongly. And so I think we need to be aware that there is strength and weakness in both the conservative and in the literal position. And so recognizing the difference and value between the conservative and the literal position can be very valuable. And we spoke a bit about that yesterday, and Tillich, you brought up some good points there about that need for balance, that need to find the middle position between the conservative and the literal view. Otherwise, we can, find difficulties if we don't find the right approach there. So I think we need to find the healthy balance between the literal and the metaphor, and that's what's being raised here is the question of what's a metaphor and what is literal, and so we need to find that balance there. Um, so there's some thoughts I put down before on conservatism and its approach to thinking, and it just struck me as being quite important to be able to differentiate between the strengths and limitations of both approaches. And so let's see if we can go to some of those notes that I put down before, if they're readily accessible. Conservative. So here's some notes I put down before on conservative versus liberal. Both conservative and liberal, Christian and broader religious theology views have strengths and weaknesses. Conservative theology emphasizes authority. It seeks to emphasize the authority of the Bible, but there is always a leader or a group that interprets the Bible, and so it gives power to them. And sometimes it reduces questioning. And so one of the dangers is if you reduce questioning, then the leader or the group can have too much unquestioned authority. And God's given us a capacity to question, and Jesus reminds us of the value of questioning. The conservative theology emphasizes the tradition of the group. So if your group is Baptist, it emphasizes baptizing. If your group is Seventh-day Adventist, it emphasizes the seventh day, the Saturday. If your group is Catholic, it emphasizes the Catholic. If your group is Pentecostal, it emphasizes the Pentecostal. So whatever the group is, there's a certain tradition. If it's Methodist, it emphasizes John Wesley. If it's Lutheran, it emphasizes Martin Luther. If it is Presbyterian, it emphasizes John Calvin. And so these different traditions could shape the way things are understood, but then the leader will also decide what happens. Often it has a rigidity and an inflexibility, but that's a challenge because there are different people in your group. Some are more outgoing extroverts, some are more ingoing introvert. And so there's a challenge with the conservative. There is a strength about the conservative and people like it. It has a clear moral framework. It has continuity with Bible and tradition, strong sense of identity and tight knit. But this can also lead to rigidity and exclusivity and a lack of questions or dialogue and an overemphasis on doctrine without care and compassion and love. The liberal theology, on the other hand, wants to be free of any restrictions and to think freely and openly, to look at science and reason freely, which is sound because God is in scientific knowledge and reason. It wants to emphasize caring for everyone, women and the needy and the disadvantaged. It emphasizes compassion, equality, justice, because it has emerged as a liberating theology, bring freedom from that which is restrictive. It
बनाने
emphasizes
वाले हैं
flexibility and
ए
adaptability
गरम गरम से खा
and
रहे हो
dialogue
तो
and
फिर यार
interfaith and
तो
ecumenical
खा
dialogue and love and inclusion.
ना
But
ठीक है
sometimes it may bring so much of this openness and freedom that it forgets about what the Bible says and it forgets about relating with God and praying, and it just focuses on the self and what we think. And everything becomes relative and nothing becomes acceptive. And so it comes up with a new way of going. So, what is needed is a balanced approach that recognizes the incredible value of biblical truth, but combined with thoughtful interpretation and context, that balances moral clarity with compassion and justice and care, that balances tradition with openness to questions and new insights, that balances faith with thinking, with credibility, but also with spiritual depth. And so, if we can have this balance of liberal and also liberal insights and conservative strength, then I think that can help us to interpret passages such as we read in Genesis, that we are reading, that we read in Genesis 1, 2, 3, and we are also reading today, then that will be very useful and helpful to us. So we're reminded today that context is important, and we're reminded that literary understanding of the genre is important, and there could be other literary approaches as well. So all of these insights are going to be very important for us. Let's go now to Genesis chapter 12, where we're going to begin to look at today. And we could go to Genesis 12 interlinear. That would enable us to examine the actual Hebrew words that are used, but it'll probably be easier for us to read the NIV. So we'll go back to the NIV in a moment. But in the interlinear, you've got God speaks to Abraham and tells him to leave. We can look up that word leave, to go, to walk, to depart, to move, to live. And to leave your country. So Abraham was in a particular city, in a particular culture, and if he was going to form his own sense of identity and understand God fully, he had to leave some of those things behind. I'm reminded that this parallels our own journey as we move from childhood to adulthood. There are certain things that we must leave behind. Abraham was told that he had to leave his relatives behind, that is, who were his extended family, his aunts and uncles, because they had a way of doing things and thinking, and he had to leave them behind. And sometimes, if we're going to go forward, we've got to leave that behind. The Bible tells us about respecting and honoring our parents, but it also reminds us, as Jesus said, that there are times when we must leave and go forward, as Jesus did in relation to his own family, if we're going to be complete and whole. So you've got to have your own sense of identity as to who you are, but at the same time, you need to honour your father, mother, and parents as well. And then we have a revelation that comes from God. And so Genesis 12 is partly about the principle or concept of revelation. And we can talk here about the many ways God speaks to us. As you walk and pray, God may speak into your life and give you a vision of a work to do, a vision of what He is calling you to do. And often it's wise to check that vision with other people you respect and trust, and you may find pastors and others that you can share with and say, I sense God is calling me to do such and such. And sometimes they may support you, and sometimes, like Joseph, who shared with his family, I sense God has got my father to give me a wonderful coat, and now he is calling me to do wonderful things. And they turned against Joseph. And sometimes you'll find that people won't necessarily agree with the vision that you sense God is giving you. You could journal that. You could pray about it and you could write it down, and God could give you a revelation. And so we wrestle with that sense of revelation. I remember when I was pastoring, I prayed and God gave me a vision and a word, and I stepped out. And that very day, another pastor rang up and said, "Could I lead a church?" And I sensed the call of God, and I set off on a journey that led me on further and further. When I went to study further, I prayed and sensed God saying, "Here is a place where you could study and learn more." And I responded to that. And so as you journey, God can speak. I heard another person who went recently to Scotland to study, and he felt a lonely experience. He felt a scary experience, but God was with him on that journey. And so we can identify with this sense of revelation and call as he went forward. He had to leave his household behind, his dwelling, his habitation, and often we feel comfortable in the area where we are. I've met farmers who've had to leave their farm behind in order to go and train to be a pastor and a minister, and they could have stayed with that farm, but they left it behind to go to the place that God had called them to. So there is that which is to be left behind if we are to go forward. And then go to the land that I will show you. So often what unfolds in our lives is very much related to the place that God calls us to. So it's important to prayerfully ask, where are you calling? So this is the beginning of the narrative arc, this challenge to leave and set off on a journey. Someone has said that there are 7 basic storylines or narrative arcs, and then there are the 7 story lines, narratives there that could be that we might tell. And one of them is this journey narrative that we might go on, that we could set off on. And then there are other stories, tragedy and other stories that we might journey on as well. And so there are various ways that we could tell the stories, but certainly the Genesis story takes us along this. Stephen Booker is famous for identifying 7 storylines, and he says one of the 7 storylines is this journey where we set off from one place and we journey towards another. So if you want to read an interesting book, or go online and look for Stephen Booker's book on the 7 storylines or plots, then that could be interesting to explore those. We're looking mainly now at the Abraham narrative. Stephen Booker says that there is a monster to be faced and overcome, and that's a bit like Genesis 3, where they face temptation. And then there's the rags to riches. Abraham leaves behind but goes forward in hope. There is the quest which Abraham is on, that is, you're questing the promised land. There's the voyage, and then there could be return. So Joseph sets off on a voyage towards the promised land, and then he finds his family again. In the story, there can be comedy and laughter. There can be tragedy where much is lost, like in the story of Saul, and then there can be hope of being reborn and renewed. And so if you want to find out more, you could actually type into Google Christopher Booker 7 Basic Narrative Plot Summary, and in that summary you would find that there'll be a number of scholars and writers have summarized the 7 basic stories. But we're really working today on the main idea of a journey towards a promised hope, and then there'll be challenges along the way. So here's Stephen Booker's 7 basic plots: overcoming the monster, rag to riches, the quest, voyage, comedy, tragedy, and then rebirth. And we're really on a voyage or a quest. We're setting out on that journey. Sometimes this is called pilgrimage. And so, if you were to go to Google Scholar and do a search on Abraham and his journey as a pilgrimage, so if you go to Genesis 12 and Abraham and look at as a journey narrative pilgrimage, then you'll see that there are ways in which it could be seen as being like a life journey. That is, God calls us on a journey going somewhere. And you can see that a number of scholars have thought about the way our life is a journey towards somewhere. And the writers and authors of the Abraham journey are wanting us to learn from Abraham's life journey as we might apply it to our own life journey. One of the challenges is, does it apply in similar ways to all our lives, or are some of our life journeys quite different? And so we may need to show you some care at times as to the differences, but certainly there's very valuable insights in exploring the way in which we are on a pilgrimage journey like Abraham, moving towards his promises and hopes that he's leading us towards. So if you wanted to look forward into this, then you could make a note of this resource. You could do a search on this as well, and you could find in Google Scholar this resource that I have found in Google Scholar, which is Abraham and the metaphor of Christian pilgrimage. And that's one way of seeing what we are looking for. I think, as you pointed out, Tillich, we need to think about what is the central most important thing. And scholars would say the central most important thing is to understand God. That is, God is wanting to bring good in our lives. God is wanting to work things out for good in our lives. And as He seeks to work things out for good in our lives, then He also gives us wisdom, and He gives us His laws, and He gives us His guidance. I think that's important. And so wisdom is central. So God revealing, God guiding, God wanting good for our lives, and God calling us on mission. All of these are central ideas that we see here in the Abraham journey. So there's a lot in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 through to the end of chapter 12. But really, we're just focusing at the moment the importance of context, the importance of thinking about the literary nature of what's being communicated. And what's the purpose? The purpose is that you and I might have life and learn. God's seeking it for all time, not just for ancient Israel, but for you and I, that we might learn from Abraham's life and journey and apply it in our lives. Let's take a 5-minute break there at this point, and we'll come back in 5 minutes' time and look further at Genesis chapter 12 and the Abraham story and narrative and what